Okay, so last time we talked about proxy contest and we talked about going private transactions, and we said that going private transactions helped to really focus management on fixing the firm because of what disciplining effect? How do they pay for the company? Are they naturally wealthy? No, if you're going to buy something that you can't afford, what do? Borrow money, right? And so they've got all this debt they're going to have to pay off. And so that gives us this disciplining effect of debt. Before we get too much further, I want to point out Mr. Sadai's hair. It's fabulous. I am so pleased that I would hire you now. Yeah?
Appreciate it.
If only I had a job opening. Okay, so back to the story. We also talked about the proxy vote. I told you about Disney. What was the big advantage of a proxy vote versus trying to buy the shares? Ms. Bergner, what's the big advantage of proxy vote over trying to buy the shares? Let me give you a hint. Do you have to buy the shares for a proxy battle? No. How much does it cost you? Nothing except for your PR cost to reach out to the shareholders, right? And so that's the big advantage of the proxy battle. Okay, so now let's talk about some alternatives to mergers. First of all, let's talk about the strategic alliance. This is where two firms act to work together to their mutual benefit. Now, they're not necessarily getting assets together. We're going to see that would be called a joint venture. But they're deciding to work together. And the most common one that you see is the code share agreement between airlines. It's 1998, and I get a call at my desk in Dallas, Texas. And they tell me to get to the airport, or to go home, pack a bag, get to the airport, because we have trouble at our plant in Arborough, Scotland. And so I've got to get on the plane and go, right? So I go home, get my bag. I had the ticket at the counter because back then we didn't have electronic tickets, right? And so it starts out American Airlines, like Flight 36 or whatever, to London. And then there's another American Airlines with a 4-digit number after it that's going to take me on to Aberdeen, which is close to Arborough. Okay, so I get to the airport, I get on the plane, it's American Airlines. Of course, since I was the last guy to book a seat, I am sitting in the middle of a 5-across section in the middle, against the bulkhead, with no ability to, okay. So there I was for 9 hours, right? Okay, so then I get to London, and we go through, and I'm looking for American Airlines Flight 5436. And this poor British woman, she took pity on me, and she says, "Can I help you?" And I told her what was going on. She says, "Oh, that's a code share flight." And she says it'll actually be on British Airways. And so we trotted over to that area and got on the plane. Now, I will tell you that a couple of interesting things about flying with British people on British Airways. Number one, as soon as the plane breaks through the clouds, all the British people do this. Do you know why? They only see the sun like 3 days a year. And so this is like, okay. The second thing was there was free beer, which you never get on these short-haul domestic flights in the U.S. Now, I'm sure they've just changed that by now. Okay. But why was I routed on the British Airways? Well, it turns out that American Airlines and British Airways have a code share agreement. Now, why does that work out for both of them? Do you think it is economically advantageous for British Airways to build out an entire domestic network in the United States? No, it would be a huge investment of capital, lots of operational difficulties. And it's the same for American Airlines. It doesn't make a lot of sense for them to build out a domestic network there in the UK and then on into continental Europe. And so what they do is they feed each other passengers. And so British Airways is feeding transatlantic passengers onto American Airlines when they get to the US. American Airlines is feeding people onto British Airways once they get to the UK. Now that's the typical one that we talk about. I'm going to give you a different example, and it is the cooperation between General Motors and Ford to develop a 10-speed automatic transmission. So for those of you that don't know, the more gears you have in a transmission, the more efficient it can be, assuming that you don't make it too heavy. But does anyone walk into the car dealership and say, I want this car because it has the whatever transmission in it? You know, I'm one of the few weirdos that knows that my car has a ZF automatic transmission, 8-speed, made in Germany. And so does my wife's vehicle, even though they're two different brands. So, you know, like geeks care. Most people don't. And so Ford and GM figured this out, and they said, well, wait a minute, let's work together. And so what they did is they entered into a strategic alliance where basically Ford designed a 10-speed for rear-wheel drive, and GM designed a 9-speed for front-wheel drive applications. And then they basically share the design with each other, and they can both manufacture any of them. So that's a strategic alliance. I looked it up on Wikipedia a minute ago, and it said a joint venture. It was a joint venture, but I don't think it is because they don't have any manufacturing facility that they have bought together or that they're running together. So I wouldn't call it a joint venture. It's actually a strategic alliance. Now let's get on to what a joint venture is, and that is where two firms put up money and or assets to establish a new firm. And so the textbook is usually General Motors and Toyota, how they worked together back in the early 80s. I'm going to tell you a story from my own personal situation. When I went to work for Halliburton, it was close to right after the end of the Soviet Union. So I'm there in 1994, and the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. Here's what you need to know about the Soviet Union and the oil industry. They did not invest in their oil infrastructure like they should have. So there were a lot of wells that were producing well below their capability. And so at the end of the Cold War, basically the Russian government wanted to get these oil wells flowing again, which by the way is Russia's main form of getting hard currency, right, selling oil. And so we ended up getting into a joint venture with a local guy, a Russian. And it turns out that when the Russians pulled back from Eastern Europe, the Russian army, they had a lot of leftover trucks. And this guy bought those trucks for a song. So he has all these trucks, but he doesn't know what to do with them. In the meantime, we have just been through an oil bust, so we have a lot of spare pumps and equipment left over from that, and we don't know what to do with it, except we know that there's this thing going on in Russia. And so I don't exactly know how they got together, but our people get together with him, and we do a joint venture. He supplies the trucks and the building in Russia. We supply the refurbished pumps and the technical know-how to put them all together. Now, it's a joint venture. We've put in assets, he's put in assets, we both put in money. And we actually ran that until we ran out of trucks and pumps. I forget which ran out first. And then they shut that joint venture down. And of course, at that point, we sell the assets and we split the money however our agreement said we were going to do. So, could we have gotten into Russia to do that on our own? Probably not. Could he have put up a manufacturing facility and started creating these pumps for himself? Probably not. And so it wasn't going to hurt either one of us to join together. We actually are helping each other out. The difference between the strategic alliance and the joint venture has to do with us putting up of money and assets, not just working together. Now, here is my favorite story from our joint venture in Russia, and thankfully I have someone who can tell whether I'm full of crap when I tell this story. So my friend Andy, who's our guy on the ground in Russia, he comes back and he looks really rough. And I say, "What's up, Andy?" He says, "Doing business in Russia is crazy." And I said, "How so?" And he said, "Well, when you sign this business deal, first of all, you do a lot of drinking together, right? So am I okay so far? And what are we drinking? Vodka. Okay, so drinking a lot of vodka." He says, "And then you do the sauna together." Does this sound?
And then you jump in the snow.
Oh, okay. Well, we've skipped a step. What do you do while you're in the sauna?
You drink more.
You drink more. Very good. What else?
Oh, and then you, what do you call the things?
Willow branches?
Huh?
You hit each other with tree branches?
Yeah, what, willow branches.
Yes! And so you're beating each other with willow branches, and then you run naked into the snow, and you dive into the snow. Andy was from Oklahoma. That was really kind of cosmopolitan for Andy, right? No one believes that story unless I have someone here to testify, so I'm glad that you were here today. Okay. Questions? By the way, if you've noticed what's going on in the news, we have an authoritarian country where we're starting to see some protests, right? What do you think is going to happen if that country switches to a capitalist system? Well, I think we have evidence. We look at what happened in Russia. It was a freaking like gold rush, right? I actually knew people that went, made a boatload of money, spent a boatload of money. So my point to you is this. If you see one of these situations, and Russia could do it again, right? Because they're dragging their economy down right now. And if something were to change there, then there will be a lot of opportunities in Russia, a lot of opportunities in this other country who I shall not name. Does that make sense? And so if you want to look for opportunities, look where things have been dragged down, beaten down, and that now that there's going to be a regime change. And by that I mean a change in what's going on. I'm not talking about the government necessarily. But it's a huge opportunity, and that's what we were there for in Russia. I talked too long. Okay, questions? Now let's talk about taxable acquisitions, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier. The taxability is for the target shareholders, the people who are selling their shares. And it would only be taxable if they're selling the shares for more than they paid for them. If you sell your shares for more than you paid for them, what kind of tax do you have to pay, Mr. Corbin? You are Mr. Corbin. Who's Mr. Corbin? Raise your hand.
Corbin?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know you said Corbin. Sorry.
I can tell he's not listening to a thing I say because he doesn't even hear his own name.
Capital gains tax.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Back to the story. So, capital gains tax. Generally, cash acquisitions are taxable simply because most of the time you're selling your shares for more than you paid for them. Unless you bought the shares back, unless you bought FTX when it was so high, and then, right? Does that make sense? You guys know about FTX? Yeah. Did FTX ever go public? I know it just took a huge dump, right? Okay, let's use another company. What about Uber? Uber's, right? Lots of companies have done this deal. In fact, Amazon lost like $1 trillion in value. So if someone were to buy Amazon right now and pay cash for the shares, there's a chance that the people who were selling the shares would actually be taking a capital loss, and that acquisition would not be taxable to them. But if they are, let's say I bought the shares yesterday and they make the offer today, you know they've got to offer more than the current share price. I'm going to probably owe a capital gains tax. Questions? Okay, now, if I am the CEO of the acquiring firm, do I really care about the taxability to the target shareholders? Not really, except for the attractiveness of the offer to them, right? If it's taxable, if they're going to have to pay a tax, I might have to sweeten my offer to help cover those taxes. Does that make sense? Okay, now, if we have shares, if we offer shares, then it's not considered taxable because we've just had an exchange of equity interest from one firm to another. In other words, they just traded their shares in one firm for the shares in another. Now, in order for these to be tax-free, first of all, there's a couple of rules. Number one is the acquisition must be for business purposes, not just to evade paying taxes. By the way, I'm going to teach you how to evade paying taxes, right? But it can't be the main reason. It can't be the main reason for the merger. And so even if you were going to do one of these things purely for tax purposes, here's what you do. And the announcements always sound like this. We are pleased to announce the acquisition of Loser Corp. By the way, it's Loser Corp because I'll tell you why in a minute. Okay, so we're going to announce our acquisition of Loser Corp. We feel that there are tremendous synergies and economies of scale to be gained by joining our two great firms. And then I give it like 2-second pause, and then I say, by the way, there may also be some tax benefits. Right? Did you hear how that was in smaller print? May also be. Okay, so it can be in there, but it just doesn't need to be the main deal. And we've already talked about the continuity of equity interest. As long as the people have the shares in the new firm and they don't sell them, then it's a non-taxable acquisition to them. We'll get to the tax situation here in a little bit, but first let's talk about how we account for acquisitions. We used to have this thing called pooling of interest. And that would be where if these two firms merge, all we do is we just add our balance sheets together. Now, the balance sheet, remember, the book values are historical cost minus accumulated depreciation, right? And so you could easily just put these things together. But that's been outlawed now. That's been outlawed. I believe the merger I was involved with was pooling of interest. They've outlawed that. And now what you have to do is the purchase accounting method. And the purchase accounting method is actually far more complex. And here's why. We have to figure out a fair market value for every single asset that we're purchasing. Some of that may be easy to do. Some of it may be hard to do. And so we're probably going to hire some consultants. By the way, I'm available for $2,000 an hour plus expenses. Hire a consultant to help us value these things. And then we're going to put them on our books at their fair market value. Now here's the problem. I'm probably going to pay more for this target company than the sum of the fair market value of its assets. And here's why. Is there value to a business beyond the value of its individual assets? Oh, yeah. And so you look at things like the brand name, the customer base, there's all sorts of reputation, there's all sorts of things that we're willing to pay for that don't show up in the sum of the fair market value of the assets. And so the amount over and above that sum that we pay is it's accounted for as goodwill. Goodwill. And so when you see goodwill on a balance sheet, that's where it came from. And this is an intangible asset. An intangible is one you can't touch. Your car is a tangible asset. Your love for the Kansas City Chiefs, intangible. You can't put your hands on it, right? Okay. Now, let's talk about goodwill. It used to be you had to amortize it over 10 years. In other words, it basically was going away. And that would impact, because every time that you write down $100,000 worth of goodwill, you have to take a $100,000 charge on your income statement. And so it makes your profits look lower, lower, lower. But the companies went to the Financial Accounting Standards Board and they said, wait a minute. Goodwill might not go away. If you bought, let's say you bought Hershey's Chocolate Company, do you think that all the goodwill associated with that's going to be gone after 10 years? No, that name brand still continues to have positive feeling for Americans. And so what we're going to see here is that instead of amortizing it over a certain number of years, what we're going to do is check it annually for impairment. Check it annually for impairment. And I have a really great example of this. Adidas and a certain individual had a deal going together where they were selling some weird shoes. Who was the individual? You guys don't even want to say his name. Kanye West. Okay, so Kanye, so let's say that they purchased this little empire from Kanye, this weird shoe business. And they recorded some goodwill at the time. And Kanye continues to be the spokesperson for that line of shoes. Now, they have to check it annually for impairment. And so for the last 3 years, everything's been fine because people still like Kanye. But then Kanye sends an inflammatory tweet. And what's happening to Kanye now? Yeah, he's getting canceled. Yeah, and nobody, he's radioactive, right? Nobody wants to touch him. Now, this year, when Adidas, which by the way is actually pronounced Adidas if you're German, when they look this year to impair, whether or not they should impair that asset, that goodwill, should they? Oh yeah, I would say that goodwill's gone to zero, right? From their perspective, from the perspective of Adidas, there is no more benefit. In fact, if you could write that thing down to being negative, I would, because it's actually, do you think it's helping or hurting Adidas now, the fact that they were kind of hooked up with him? Yeah, it's hurting them. Now, you can't take goodwill any lower than zero, so there you go. Okay, questions? I'm going to give someone a chance to redeem themselves. Mr. Corbin,
Who?
where does goodwill come from? How do I record the assets of the firm that I buy on my balance sheet? What value do I use? Oh,
I don't
man.
know. I'm not redeeming myself.
You're not.
I'm not.
So I thought he might actually listen after our last exchange, but apparently not. Okay, so we're going to put them on there at the fair market value. And so if I sum up the fair market value of all those assets, do you think that's going to be more or less than I actually pay for this company that I'm buying?
Less.
Very good. And so that difference between the amount that we pay and the sum of the fair market value of those assets, what do we call that?
Goodwill.
Whew, there you go. See, he knew all along. Okay, questions? Now we're going to talk about the gains from acquisitions. If there weren't gains from acquisitions, there would be no reason to do it. And we need to remember that the goal of financial management is to maximize shareholder wealth. And keep in mind that as an acquiring manager, I am responsible to the shareholders of my company, not to those of the target firm. And just like choosing an investment project like a factory or a machine or anything else, we should look and make sure that our mergers or acquisitions are going to be positive in PV. And positive in PV to our current shareholders, not to everybody after it's all done, because certainly we're going to be giving part of the value to the target shareholders. So the big question is, where do these gains come from in acquisitions? And they fall into 4 possible categories, and we're going to talk we're going to talk about each of these in depth. First of all, we've got revenue enhancement, more money coming in. We've got cost reductions, less money going out. We've got lower taxes, which we mentioned briefly a minute ago, and then a reduction in capital needs. Capital would be the long-term investments we make, like property, plant, equipment, things like that. So let's start with revenue enhancement. The first one that's listed up here is marketing gains. And one of the things that people tend to mention when they're doing mergers or acquisitions is, oh yeah, their advertising stinks. They've been wasting their money on advertising. We are going to take that same money and use it in our superior advertising platform or whatever, and we will get greater benefit from that. And in fact, that was one of the arguments for the merger between Sprint and Nextel back in the day. You guys don't even remember Nextel, but it's where you push the button on the phone and you could use them like walkie-talkies. We thought it was really cool back in the day. Obviously didn't really work for people, right? Or they would still have phones like that. Okay, so that was one of the arguments that they made. I'm not a big believer in that. Everybody thinks that their way is superior. One thing that I do think is good with marketing gains is distribution. So let's think of a local goat farmer. Local goat farmer, he has 2 products, goat milk and goat cheese. And by the way, do a lot of people like goat milk? No. And there are like maybe 3 kinds of people who like goat cheese. There are like Europeans, like French people. They call it chiv, which actually means goat in French. And then there are, you know, like hippies. And then there's my wife and me, right? So those are your big goat cheese eaters. So if you look around Springfield, do you see a lot of sophisticated Europeans? No. I'm surprised it took you a while to come to that conclusion. Okay, no. What about hippies? We got about 4 or 5 dozen, right? Not enough to support a big cheese operation. And then, of course, there's my wife and me. And so it's really not that big of a market, but this guy's got a boatload of goats. And so he's making a lot of cheese. But we know the supply and demand. The demand's low, the supply is high. You can buy his goat cheese for a song, simply because there's just not that demand for it around here. Now, another company we have here in town is Kraft Heinz. What's the Kraft half of that best known for? Yeah, cheese. The mac and cheese is what they make here, but they were, to begin with, a cheese company. And so they have this amazing worldwide distribution network. It's a global company, right? So what would happen if Kraft were to buy this local goat cheese operation? The value would increase because now they're able to go out and sell that chev, which is the goat cheese. They're able to sell it for a lot more because of they're meeting demand elsewhere, right? So the supply remains the same, the demand increases, that means the price goes up. Does the goat farmer's cost go up any? No. And so just by simply taking advantage of that distribution network, they can have some marketing gains there. And then we talk about strategic benefits. And this is, you have to think more than one step down the line. And so one of our big examples of this is Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble started out as a company that made basically soap-type products, right? In fact, back in the 50s, the primary advertiser on these daytime dramas that the stay-at-home moms watched was Procter & Gamble. And because all the ads were for soap, they became known as soap operas, right? They were soap operas. You guys don't even know about soap operas? Holy crap. Okay, I know they're not that popular anymore, but I think that the term would at least show up in your mind. Okay, so soap operas. Now, moving forward, Procter & Gamble wants to expand. They still want to be a consumer products company, but they know that the soap thing, they've made it as big as it's going to get. And so what do? They make a decision to push into paper products. And so the first thing that they think is, let's do toilet paper. But it turns out that making toilet paper is technically difficult. I mean, we all take it for granted, right? I hope we all take it for granted. You know, it's technically difficult to manufacture. In fact, the original patent from Scott Tissue Company specifically mentions the ability to get the splinters out of the paper, because the paper's made from what material? Trees, wood, right? And so can you imagine getting the toilet paper before then came with splinters, right? You gotta have a sharp eye to make that work. If I have to explain that to you, there's a problem, right? Okay, so now they've got this, they bought Charmin, they buy Charmin, and now they have the technology. But they don't just stop with Charmin. What else do you think they can do with this technology? Picture in your head something that looks kind of like toilet paper, but comes on a bigger roll. It's like toilet paper for giants. Paper towels, right? And so Procter & Gamble, I actually fooled a guy into thinking that one time. I'm like, dude, look, they put out toilet paper for giants. This is a guy I worked at the store with. I think he's in prison. Okay, back to the story. I broke my finger. Back to the story. They come out with Bounty paper towels. That was the first product that came out of this. Now, that product didn't exist when they bought Charmin, but they used this strategic benefit of owning Charmin to be able to make that jump. And then they decided that they could move into other areas. Fast forward to about 1967. By the way, I was born in 1971. I was the last of my cousins to be raised in washable cloth diapers. What happened after that?
Diapers that got invented, I guess.
No. So I actually had, we weren't savages. I had diapers, right? But they were made of cloth, and you wash them and
You
reuse them.
mean like the once disposable?
Yeah, the disposable diaper. The disposable diaper, they developed Pampers in 1967, right? And so it's working in that same general area as the toilet paper. And so then they also were able to move into some like feminine hygiene and other things, all because back in the day they bought Charmin. Does that make sense? So it opened up like a whole new world for them. Okay, now let's talk about market power. If, let's say I have 1/3 of the market and Mr. Umfleet has 1/3 of the market. If we get together, we're going to control 2/3 of the market. What might we be able to do with prices? Yeah, we can raise the prices. And also, we can turn around and beat up on our suppliers and get lower prices from them. Does that make sense? And so these would all be benefits to the acquiring firm. But you got to be careful because we have federal laws against monopolies. We have these the Sherman Antitrust Act, and so the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, will look at your merger very closely. Example, Exxon and Mobil used to be two different companies, and they were both very big American oil companies. And they wanted to merge. And so the Federal Trade Commission said, no, wait a minute. You're going to have to sell some assets to make that work. And here's what they meant. If you were out in West Texas and many other places, and you pull off on an exit from the highway, there were two gas stations, Exxon and Mobil. And they kept each other in check. Does that make sense? Now, assume Exxon and Mobil merge. Now what's going on at that intersection? We've got two gas stations from fundamentally the same company. Do they have to compete anymore? No. What are they going to do to the price of a gallon of gas at that exit? Right? And so what the federal government did is require them to sell a certain number of gas stations to a third party in order to get rid of this problem. And the third party turned out to be a company I've already mentioned in here, and it was Valero. Valero was a refining company, and they bought those gas stations as part of a vertical acquisition, right? Because they were making the gasoline, now they have a place to sell it. So we actually have two merger and acquisition stories there. Now, cool thing is, if you're inside of state lines, it's typically not as big of a deal. And I'll give you an actual example from when I was in doctoral school. I lived in Columbia, Missouri, which is precisely halfway between Kansas City and St. Louis. Now, Columbia has its own regional airport. It's called the Columbia Regional Airport, or CRAP for short. And the planes have like 6 seats, and you might have to hold a chicken on your lap. I mean, it's that kind of an operation. And so most people do not fly out of Columbia. Instead, they go to St. Louis or Kansas City. So it's like a 2-hour drive either way. Now, here's the problem. If you're traveling on business, your plane, you probably want to get there as early in the day as you can so you can do your business. And so that means you need to fly out at something like 6 a.m., which means you need to leave Columbia at 4 a.m., which means you have to be up at like dark 30 in order to be able to make all this work. Now, it turns out that that's dangerous because you've got these people who are like driving, sleeping. Yeah, it's really dangerous. And so there were these two hippies. This is the second time hippies have appeared in our class today. Two hippies named Doc and Tom. And they had a van, because of course hippies always had vans. They had a van and they didn't have a lot going on. And one of them came up with the idea that, hey, we could drive people to the airport in our van, right? And so they started a company called Tiger Express. And they started off, and it's like Doc and Tom in the front and the passengers in the back. And at first, they're just going to, say, Kansas City. And then they're like, hey, man, what if we bought another van? You could drive one, and I'll drive the other. Stroke of genius. So now they're going to Kansas City with one van, they're going to St. Louis with the other. Now, how do you price it? The company has to pay these people mileage for driving their own car, has to pay for their parking, right? And so basically, as long as the ticket is less than mileage and parking, then Doc and Tom can charge, we can charge up to that amount. And by the way, the company's glad because this gives the people, it keeps them from falling asleep and running off the road, right? And it also, they arrive more fresh for their appointments with the clients because everybody sleeps on the van except for Doc and Tom. Okay, so now they figure out though, they've got more demand for their service than they can meet. And so they go out and they buy some more vans. And of course, like all hippies, they've got like some hippie friends and they start driving these vans. And before long, they've got multiple trips per day back and forth. And they are just rolling in the money. Some businessmen from out of state got to look at this. And they're like, wow, that's an amazing deal. And they made Doc and Tom an offer. And they said, hey, Doc, Tom, would you sell your business for $1 million? I don't know what the true number was, but let's just say it was $1 million. And Doc and Tom are like, okay. And they sell the business, and then they're sitting on this huge stat pile of cash, but they're really bored. So what do? Well, this was back before marijuana was legal, and so they made a trip to Amsterdam. If you don't know why that's true, just go Google it. Okay, so after the trip to Amsterdam, they come back, and they're like, dude, I'm so bored. And Doc says to Tom, what do you want to do? He says, I know, let's buy a van. And so they buy a van because these idiots that bought the company from them had not made them sign a non-compete agreement, right? If you're going to buy a business like that, you have to say, you're not allowed to do business out or in this area for the next 10 years or whatever, right? Oh, by the way, why did Doc and Tom never expand outside of the state of Missouri?
Just didn't think about it.
Oh no, they thought about it. These are some smart hippies when they're not high. It gets the feds involved. Man, I don't want the feds in my business. Okay, so they sell it. Then they get the new van, and they've also got lots of money to go out and advertise. And they put on these silly ads, and it's them, and they've got this new company called MOEX from Missouri Express. And they're like, hey, remember us? We're back. And they start, and all they have to do, let's say the ticket was $50. All they have to do is charge $45. What happens to the business of Tiger Express, which they just sold? It goes down. Now, Tiger Express, they borrowed a bunch of money. The people that bought that borrowed a bunch of money to buy it. So they've got these huge fixed debt payments. And as long as they were getting $50 per trip, they could make those debt payments. But now at 45, it's looking kind of skinny. But they have to lower to 45 or they lose all their business. And so then things kind of even out again. So what do Doc and Tom do? Oh, come on, you guys just don't have enough ruthless killer instinct. What do, like hippies, what does Doc and Tom do? Yeah, they lower the price again. Now it's $40. Now the other people are like, they're like, we're not going to be making money at 40, but we have no choice. So they lower to 40. Things kind of even out again. Now, but keep in mind, Doc and Tom are sitting on a boatload of money. What can they do yet again? Lower the price down to 35. And now the people, the businessmen, give them a call. They say, let's talk. They said, how much would you give us to buy Tiger Express back? And Doc and Tom say, $100,000, man. And so they buy the business back, and the out-of-state businessmen leave in shame. Now, and then they're like, hey, yeah, we're all back together again, because they were on TV advertising. What do you think happened to the price of a ticket the very next day? Zoop! Right back up to $50, right? Do you see how this is market power? Do you see what Doc and Tom didn't want to go out of state because they didn't want to have the antitrust feds on them. Missouri antitrust, apparently not very effective, or Doc and Tom would not have stayed in business all this time. Does that make sense? Anybody here from Columbia or that area? You seen these ads? Okay. Okay, questions? Now let's talk about cost reduction. One thing we always hear about is economies of scale. And it actually makes sense. Basically, the definition of economies of scale is spreading your fixed costs over more units of production. Well, in this case, what we're doing is we're having the same units of production from the two farms, but we are reducing the fixed costs. For example, do we need 2 corporate headquarters anymore? No. Do we need 2 CEOs anymore? No. Do we need 2 CFOs? No. There's a lot of stuff that we can get down and get rid of a lot of fixed costs. And now we're spreading that lower fixed cost over the same units of production. That's economies of scale. What about economies of vertical integration? So remember we talked about how Valero bought the gas station. Do you think there might be some efficiencies to be gained to be controlling both the refinery and the gas stations? If you were dependent on other refineries who also had their own gas stations, let's say that Valero had previously been selling their gasoline, or let's talk about gas stations. If the gas stations are having to buy their gas from just whoever will sell to them, then it's possible suppliers could cut them off. But if the gas stations are connected directly to the refinery, they have this relationship that's not going to be volatile like that. And so there are some economies of vertical integration. I'll tell you an example from my own situation when I was running my safety valve business. Safety valves are, the main part of them is a long tube, which is like a round thing with a hole through the middle. And a lot of the stuff comes in, the raw materials comes in and looks like this. And so that is a tube. But we would also get in stuff that looks like this. This is called bar stock. And then I have to put a hole through that. Now, the drill that put the hole through it was actually in another, I was a production group leader, it was in another cell for another production group leader. Do you think my work ever had priority on that drill? No, it didn't matter if I had a hot order from the Middle East that I had to really get on and get out. If he had anything at all at the drill, my stuff was always behind his. That's just how people are, right? People are scumbags. So what do? I go out and I buy what's called a turret lathe, and I set it up and kind of make a makeshift drill out of it. Is it as fast as the regular drill? No. Is it more expensive than the regular drill to drill that way? Absolutely. But what did I gain from doing it? I gained control of my process. So beforehand, making promises to customers was very difficult because I didn't know how long, the guy's name was Jason. I didn't know how long Jason was going to sit on my bar stock before he blew a hole through it. Well, now I know it's going to take a little longer to drill, but I can control when the drilling happens. Therefore, I'm able to meet more promises to customers. Therefore, we're able to sell more stuff because people aren't constantly angry at us. And so that's another benefit of vertical integration, being able to control your own process. Any questions so far? Okay, let's talk about complementary resources. And this is where you make better use of your existing resources. The traditional example is the patio fireplace store. Picture 2 stores, one on both sides of Glenstone Avenue. One is a patio store and one is a fireplace store. And in the summertime, the fireplace store owner is looking across the street and sees all the business at the patio store and is very envious and feels deeply, deeply bad for himself. But when winter comes, the owner of the patio store is looking across the street at the fireplace store and seeing all the people there, no people at her store, and she feels very, very badly for herself, right? Now, they meet together. It used to be Anton's Coffee. It's shut down. They meet together at Anton's Coffee Shop, and they're both complaining about the situation. And it comes upon them that, wait a minute, what if we merged our operations? We could get into one building, sell the other building, and then in the summertime we'd be busy selling patio stuff, and in the wintertime we'd be busy selling fireplace stuff, and we could be busy all the year around. Does that make sense? Okay, now let's give another example of this. I'll give you two more examples. The first, when I lived in Louisiana, in the town of Lafayette, they had an amateur semi-pro ice hockey team, and they were called the Ice Gators. Have you heard of the Ice Gators?
Mm-hmm.
Well, are they still there?
I don't think so.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. In fact, my Cajun friends that would go to the matches, what they were really excited about was like the hot dog cannon. They really didn't care about hockey at all, right? Okay, so back to the story. The Ice Gators. By the way, do you think the semi-pro hockey season lasts year around? No, no sports season does, right? Because otherwise the injuries would just kill everyone. So back to the story. What do? They make a deal, and they also get an arena football team. Arena football, turns out the season does not overlap ice hockey. So just twice per year they have to convert, right, back and forth between ice hockey and arena football. You guys know about arena football? It's played on a smaller field with slightly worse players and slightly less attractive cheerleaders. That's arena football. And I could say that I knew one of the cheerleaders. And yeah. Anyway, back to the story. She's lovely. Okay, back to the story. So that's complementary resources. And we see the same thing with our own JQH. Primarily, the arena was built for what? Men's basketball, right? And then we also, though, they'll bring in concerts, and they bring in the pro bull riders, which is fascinating because they bring in like all this dirt and put it on the floor. I'm just amazed that they managed to get it cleaned up in time for the next basketball game. But there's all these uses for this thing going on in between the games and outside of the basketball season. Okay, let's see. Oh, and then the final one I'm going to give you, because you'll probably see it on the exam. Mr. Corbin, did you pick up on that?
Got it.
Very good. Let's talk about ski resorts. Ski resorts, there's typically a mountain involved. And where is the lodge? Is it on the top of the mountain? No, it's down here, right? So you got your ski lodge, and it's actually much better looking than that. Very large, lovely rooms, right? And during the winter, you've got lots of people that come here and ski. But in the summertime, what happens?
The snow melts.
The snow melts. And so for the longest time, they were trying to figure out what they could do in the summer to get revenue. And they started having people like ride mountain bikes and stuff down the ski paths, which killed a bunch of people. Anyway, what do they do? They're like, what if we could hire someone like Arnold Palmer and create some amazing golf course, that's the little flag in the hall, create some amazing golf course out here, and then people in the warm months could come, play golf, and stay in the lodge. And in the wintertime, they can ski and stay in the lodge. And by the way, this thing actually makes you more robust to global warming, right? Because now, if you've got snow less of the year, what happens? You've got golf more of the year. Does that make sense? That's an example of complementary resources. Undoubtedly will show up on the exam. Questions? So let's talk about how we can lower our taxes. And the first one is the use of tax losses. When you lose money as a business, do you think that you pay negative taxes? In other words, the government sends you a check for losing money. No. They say, and you say, wait a minute, that's not fair. You tax me when I'm profitable, but you don't give me any money when I'm unprofitable. They say, well, how about this? You can hold on to those losses, and if you make money next year, you can reduce your taxes by subtracting out those losses, and then you pay the tax on the difference. Now, what if you are a habitual loser? Remember Loser Corp? Habitual loser, meaning that you constantly are losing money. Are you ever going to have a chance to use those tax losses? No. Now let's say that I am a winner company, and I'm constantly making money. I've always got positive profits. I'm always paying taxes. But if I buy a loser corp, I can utilize their tax losses to reduce my profit and therefore reduce my taxes. I can use it to reduce my taxable income. And so this is a benefit. By the way, would you buy a company just because it's losing money? No. What I want to do is I want to find a company that has a solid business model that's just been ran poorly, right? And then I'm going to do two things. Number one, I'm going to take advantage of those tax losses, and number two, I'm going to fix the operation and turn it around. Does that make sense? Okay. We also have unused debt capacity. We talk about firms having a debt capacity, and it really boils down to this. People will only loan you up to a certain proportion of your assets at normal rates. And so, and it's different by different kinds of firms. You know, banks run on 90% debt. Electric utilities run on around 50% debt. And so if your firm is currently, let's say you're an electric utility, and you are currently running at 50% debt, you have used all your debt capacity. If you try to go beyond that, people are going to start charging you kind of crazy interest rates. And so what you can do is go out and merge with another electric utility who has not used all their debt capacity. So let's say we go out and find one that's only 25% financed with debt. What can we do? We can put those companies together, and now let's assume they're the same size. It's 37.5% debt. I can borrow up to that new 50% level, buy back shares, and as a result, basically, now I've got additional tax benefit that was being foregone by the target company. By the way, one of the benefits of debt is that interest is tax deductible. And so we talk about the tax shield. Remember from chapter 8, the tax shield? That's what we're talking about here, is we're the ability to reduce our taxes using interest. Now, let's talk about this from a perspective that you might understand better. Let's say that you've maxed out your credit cards. I'm going to pick on Ms. Menace because she has recently become engaged. Congratulations, Ms. Menace.
Thank you.
Okay, so here's the deal. Let's say that Ms. Menace, do you want to be the good guy or the bad guy in this story?
The good one.
Okay, Ms. Menace is very fiscally prudent, and I have no reason to think otherwise. She's very fiscally prudent. But her husband-to-be, unbeknownst to her, has maxed out all of his credit cards. Yeah? Okay. Now, here's what's going to happen. When he marries her, he's going to try to take advantage of her unused debt capacity, right? He's like, whoa, you got a 10,000 limit on this card, right? I've been looking for a new jet ski or whatever, right? And then he goes out. By the way, my cousin did this to his wife. What a jerk. This is the problem. Do you see that? By the way, did you run a credit check on it?
No.
You probably should. Yeah. You always want to do these like open and transparent things. It's like, okay, I want to do a credit check on you, but in fairness, I'm going to do one for me, and we're going to look at them both together, right? Oh, yeah. You don't want to find this stuff out after. Yeah. See, I might have saved your marriage right now.
You might have.
Yeah. Or I might have ruined it. Who knows? Okay. Okay. Then we have use of surplus funds. Keep in mind that the money at the firm belongs to who? The shareholders. And so if I have invested in every positive NPV project, that money that's left over, I should be sending back to the shareholders, either through dividends or share repurchases. But you'll hear managers make this argument. Say, oh yeah, when we send them a dividend, they have to pay taxes, and when we do share repurchases, they have to pay capital gains taxes, and we don't want to do that to our poor shareholders. So we're going to invest in this slightly negative NPV acquisition because overall the shareholders are still better off versus they would have been if they had had to pay taxes on that money that we should have sent them. Now, do I think this is a good reason? No. Does it sound like managers making excuses for doing things they wanted to do anyway? Absolutely, right? We know people are scumbags. Very good, thank you. Okay, and then there's the ability to write up depreciable assets. So you remember we said that when you go out and buy assets from other people, you have to put them on your books at, Mr. Corbin?
Goodwill? Or are you saying?
We have to put them on our balance sheet at their what kind of value?
Face value?
Market.
Okay, fair market value, right?
Fair market value.
There you go.
Yeah.
Mr. Corbin, I should have started picking on you way sooner in the
Oh, you
semester.
should have. I'm getting killed out here.
Yeah. I'll bet you'll actually study harder, maybe. This is my
Maybe,
hope.
maybe.
This is my hope. Who knows? Okay. Are you graduating this semester?
Next semester.
Oh, okay. Well, he doesn't quite have the senioritis yet. Okay, back to the story. We should come up with a different name for that, because you guys aren't seniors, you're graduate students, right?
We've just been in school for so long.
Yeah, so you're still suffering from senioritis from the first go-around, right? Okay, back to the story. When you put those on your, so let's say they were all on the other people's books at zero. When I buy them and put them on my books at fair market value, what can I start doing now? I can depreciate them all over again. Does that blow your mind? We can just keep handing this machine back and forth, and we can both depreciate it. Because every time someone buys it, it goes on their books at fair market value, and then they're able to depreciate it down. Now, why do we care about depreciation? What does it impact? Mr. Scott.
Taxes.
Taxes, very good. And so the more depreciation I have on my an income statement, the lower my taxes are. Does that make sense? Okay. And by the way, does depreciation actually cost me any money? No. If I go out and buy an asset and don't depreciate it versus do depreciate it, it's really no difference in the cash flow except for the impact on taxes. Now we have the reduction in capital needs. So earlier we talked about the complementary assets and how they could sell one of the buildings, you know, either the patio store or the fireplace store. But we can look at bigger examples of that. So for instance, I'm going to throw out a couple of car companies here. By the way, Chrysler's new name is, does anyone know what it is? Stellantis, which sounds like an antacid, right? Okay, so Stellantis and Hyundai. Hyundai makes reliable cars at a fair price. Hyundai's plants are running at 100% capacity. If Hyundai wanted to make another single car, they have to go out and build a new plant, which they are. Now, let's look at Stellantis. Stellantis's factories are running more at, say, 65% capacity. Why do you think Stellantis's factories are running at a lower capacity? A couple of reasons. Say again?
No demand for their products.
Yeah, so there's less demand for their products. They built the assets out back when there was more demand for their products. What killed the demand for their products?
Products.
They suck, right? I can tell you about my wife's Plymouth Neon. They suck. She doesn't have it anymore, thank God. Okay, back to the story. And so what's happening here is that they have extra capacity in their factories. And so if Hyundai wanted to pick up some capacity without building any new factories, they just go out and buy Stellantis, and then they can start making Hyundais in the Stellantis factories and run those up to 100% of capacity. They can get out more Hyundais without having to build another factory. Now there's one downside to this whole thought, and that is people are picky about where their cars are made. Did you know that? I mean, geeks will look at the VIN number and figure out, oh, wait a minute, that was made at that Stellantis factory. I don't want that one, right? So let's talk about toothpaste. What if you had two different brands of toothpaste? You could do something like that because no one looks at tubes and tries to figure out what factory the toothpaste came out of. Does that make sense? So, yes?
So during merger or when you acquire a company, can the negative image of the other company affect yours?
Oh, absolutely. Roll back to Daimler Chrysler. When Mercedes bought Chrysler, my estimation of Mercedes dropped precipitously that day. And do you think now, I'm thinking, what else are they doing wrong?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And that was one of the reasons I thought that merger was really stupid. And in this case, the previous one we showed, it might be a bad idea. That's what I was saying, is you got to be careful because Chrysler has this reputation, right? And you don't want to get that smeared on you. Good question. Okay, number one here, we're talking about how to avoid mistakes. Number one, don't ignore market values. If the standalone value of the company is $4 billion, what's the most likely true value of the firm? $4 billion, right? The market gives us our absolute best swag at what the company's worth. And you get problems where executives get these finance people working for them, and the finance people are like, they think they're brilliant, and they say, oh, I figured out that this company's actually worth more than $4 billion, it's worth $5 billion. So if we go out and buy it for $4.5 billion, it will still be $500 million in the black on this deal. Do you think that's likely to be true? No. And in fact, as Richard Roll said in his hubris hypothesis, we're really only observing one part of the distribution of this. Because if someone makes an estimate of the value of the firm and it's, say, below $4 billion, are they going to go out and offer, say, $3.5 billion to the current shareholders? No, because the current shareholders can sell right now for $4 billion, right? It wouldn't make any sense. And so only when we see these estimates of the value of the firm that exceed the market value do we see bids. Okay, estimate only the incremental cash flows. This is just like Chapter 8. We're only going to look at cash flows that change as a result. Those are the economies of scale, the marketing gains, all those things. I hear this argument, it's like, oh, if we buy this firm, we can increase our earnings per share by 3 cents. But it's just combining the profits of the two existing firms as they are. There's no synergy involved there. That's dumb. Don't do that. Use the correct discount rate. So when I worked at Halliburton, the discount rate that we had to use for everything, we've talked about this before, was 11.9%. And so we were looking at this Scottish startup. And so basically, let me tell you a little bit about oil. When you have an oil well, it produces 3 things. Can anyone guess what one of them is? Oil. Very good. Okay, now the second one is a little less clear, but it's natural gas. And the third one, most people don't know about, is salt water. Anywhere you find oil, you're going to find salt water. Isn't it freaky? Oh yeah, I think it has something to do with the dinosaurs. And anyway, back to the story. So, you drill down and you want the oil for sure. If you have access to a natural gas pipeline, you want the natural gas. But what do you do with the salt water? You have to re-inject it into the ground, right? You can't just like push it into the sea because it's nasty. So you re-inject it back into the well. So there's a cost associated with that. And so what this Scottish startup did is they came up with this thing that goes down at the bottom of the well, and it reads how much oil, natural gas, and salt water were being produced by the well. And then through some magic I did not understand, they could actually like change the configuration of this thing to minimize the production of the salt water while maximizing the production of the things you wanted. That sounds pretty cool, right? Now, this thing was actually hooked to a satellite deal at the top of the well, goes off to computers, and satellites hits computers in Houston where you have nerds, and they all, this was like a very complex kind of thing, right? And it had never been tried before. So we go out there and we think this is like a really good deal because we're using our discount rate of 11.9%. And then when I finally get to meet these guys, I'm talking to them, and I said, by the way, when you guys do one of these analyses for a project, how much, what kind of rate of return do you require? And the guy said, this is my crappy Scottish accent, he says, "Aye, 25%. He says, this is risky as hell, right? Whose discount rate should we have been using for that acquisition? theirs, because we were buying those risky assets. But instead, we used our low rate, made it look like a great deal. Now, do I know how that story turned out? No, it wasn't long before I left the company. But that's just one, and this happens over and over again. You're Walmart. You've got a fairly low cost of capital. You're going to go out and buy something sexy, exciting, and new. Should you use your corporate cost of capital as your discount rate for that acquisition? Absolutely not. You should be using the cost of capital for the company that you're buying. And then finally, let's beware of transactions costs. So, anytime you go out and buy another company, you've got to pay investment bankers, that's the flotation cost we discussed earlier. You've got legal fees, you've got, and so those are actual cash costs. But then there's disclosure requirements. And I might have to actually put out some information that I don't want my competitors to have, and now it's out there, and that's a cost to me. So that's a cost that I can't really put a dollar sign on, but we know it's there. So we have to be aware of that. And a lot of times, people just miss out totally on what it's going to cost to merge two operations. By the way, the people making these decisions, do you think they're at my level where they actually know what's going on? No, they're like boardroom type level, may have been an accountant in a former life, and they really don't understand how difficult it is to merge this computer system with this computer system. To take a factory full of union workers and make them play nicely with a factory full of non-union workers. There's a lot of costs that go on in all of this. And so a lot of times people underestimate those costs, so just don't do that. Now down at the bottom, we've got a note here. Replacing inefficient managers actually makes a lot of sense, but here's the problem. Do you think bidding managers tend to overestimate their abilities to manage? Yeah, this hubris is arrogance, right? And by the way, do you get to be CEO by being a very humble person? No, you got a huge amount of self-esteem or you would have never wound up in that seat. So you think you're pretty smart. And I saw this firsthand. When we were doing our merger with Dresser, my Halliburton people sent me to this Dresser plant, and they said, oh yeah, you're going to be able to make lots of improvements there because, you know, these people are like cavemen, they don't know crap from anything. You know, they just really are really dumb. When I got there, it turns out they actually were doing better than we were. And so even though that replacing inefficient managers was one of the rationales of the merger, it didn't work out. And it was because the people that sent me down there were afflicted with hubris. Okay, we've already been through that. Okay, now let's talk about defensive actions. Remember, target managers and board members. Do they want a merger to go through? No, why not?
They like what they're getting.
Yeah, they like the current situation, and there's a good chance they're going to lose their cushy job, right? And so they're going to try to fight back. And the question is this: are these defensive actions bad? Remember, the goal of financial management is to maximize shareholder wealth. And so if me as a target CEO, if my resisting actually raises they have to keep making higher and higher bids, and then we eventually sell, I have lived out the goal of financial management. But what if I just keep saying no? Then the deal doesn't go through, and I have not lived out the goal of financial management, because after all, this acquirer was having to offer a premium to buy our firm, right? My favorite example of this was Yahoo. This is back when Yahoo was, so Yahoo's been on this trajectory for a long time, right? But about here, Microsoft, which is also afflicted with hubris and has huge amounts of cash, they're like, oh yeah, we can buy Yahoo and fix it. And so they make an offer. And one of the founders, a guy named Jerry Yang, was kind of still nominally in charge at the time. And he said, so let's say they offered $18 a share. And Jerry says, no. What does Microsoft do? Yeah, they come back with, say, $21 a share. Jerry says, no. Microsoft keeps doing this. And let's say that the stock was trading at 15 before all this started. Microsoft keeps doing it. I think it gets up to like $28 a share. And Jerry stamps his feet and says, no, like a little kid. And Microsoft finally says, you know what? Forget it. Forget it. We're done. And they walk away. What do you think happened to the share price immediately after that news came out? The share price at Yahoo did what? It dropped. Now, it was 15 before all this started. Do you think it just dropped to 15? It actually dropped below because people before were pricing in the probability that Yahoo would get acquired. But now we know Jerry's not going to let that happen. And so maybe Yahoo's only worth 12. Does that make sense? Okay. So what can you do with your corporate charter? The corporate charter gives us the rules of how decisions are made at the firm. One of the things we can do when we run our corporate charter is to say you've got to have a supermajority of our shareholders required to approve being acquired, right? And we know it's really hard to get a supermajority of people or shares to agree to anything. We've already talked about that one, but there's another one that's classified directors. Let's say, and I'll give you two examples here. We've got the United States Senate and we've got the House of Representatives. How long is a term for a person in the House of Representatives? 2 years. And what percentage of them are up for election every year, every 2 years? All of them, right? And so you could totally switch out the House of Representatives every 2 years. Now, the Senate, the term is how long? 6 years. I know we make you take that class at some point, right? It's been a while. Oh, your civic pride makes me sick. Or your lack thereof. Okay, back to the story. So, 6 years. Now, the question is this. Every 2 years, I see people running for Senate. How can that be when they've got 6-year terms? What percentage of them are up for election each time? Yeah, a third. Now, we've got 100, right? So we got 33, 33, 34, 33, 33, 34. That's every 2 years, right? Now, how long would it take to turn over the House or the Senate? It's going to take you basically 6 years to turn that whole thing over, or 4 years to get a majority. You can get a majority in the House immediately, right? As long as you win the elections, you can get it. Now, what does that mean? If we have our board of directors set up like the Senate, where let's say we've got 12 directors and 2 of them are elected every year, it's going to take 6 years to change all of those out. And so this means even if I bought all the shares today, it might take me quite a long time to get enough of the board members replaced to then see things my way. And so these classified boards are meant to act as, and they do have benefits. By the way, would you want your company to switch out the entire board of directors every year? Do you think there's a bit of institutional memory that's necessary to make this thing keep rolling? Yeah. Do you think it's good to have them constantly be the same people forever? No, you want a little new blood, right? But you want to keep some people in there that know what the hell they're doing. Does that make sense? Okay, so the classified board is a defensive mechanism, but it also has some legitimate reasons to exist. Questions? Next time, we're going to finish this chapter. We are not going to do the hubris hypothesis. We're going to jump straight into chapter 17.